Welcome to Animal Justice's May panel, a bold plan for farmed animal protection in Canada. I'm Kimberly Carroll, and I will be your host tonight. I'm a strategist for animal justice and the founder of Animal Justice Academy. You can find my bio in the chat. And tonight we are going to do something really exciting. We're going to unveil a plan to create proper legal protections for farmed animals in Canada. Before we dive in, though, in the spirit of social justice for all, we'll just take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all lands throughout the world that we all find ourselves on. In Canada, we especially acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people, the first humans who called this land home. And we dedicate this gathering to the trillions of animals suffering around the world at this very moment in fishing nets, in puppy mills, in fur farms, in laboratories, in factory farms. All right, let's get to know our panelists for this evening. We're going to start with my awesome colleague from Animal Justice. Alanna Devine is our Director of Advocacy, and she's bringing over 15 years of experience in animal law and advocacy to our proceedings tonight. Alanna holds civil and common law degrees from McGill University, where she eventually taught animal law herself. She also spent more than a decade as the Director of Legal Advocacy at Montreal SPCA. Hello, Alanna.
Hi, all.
Welcome. Look at this camera, Alanna. It's good. It's an interesting one tonight.
Is it
If I
yours or
sudden
mine?
No, mine just
Okay.
keeps on
Okay.
rocking all over the place. Alanna, it's so good to have you here, my friend.
So happy to be here.
Yay. Speaking of Montreal SPCA, I want to welcome Sayara Thurston, the Senior Policy Advisor for Farmed Animals at the Montreal SPCA. Sayara has worked as a campaign and policy expert in the animal and environmental protection space for more than 15 years, including at Humane World for Animals, We Animals, and Oceania Canada. Sayara, welcome.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here.
Excellent. And folks, just so you know, we're going to put full bios. I'm just giving you a little tease of their bios. We're putting their full bios in the chat. So if you want more details, you can get them there. We also have Maha Bazzi, the Director of Animal Welfare Initiatives at Mercy for Animals. Maha has spent the last 6 years as a strategic leader in farmed animal welfare with over 6 years of experience working to alleviate animal suffering in corporate supply chains across North America. She holds a Master of Science in Animals and Public Policy from Tufts University. Welcome, Maha.
Thank you. So good to be here.
Excellent to have you. We have Riana Topan here, who is the Program Director, Farmed Animal Welfare and Protection with Humane World for Animals Canada, which is formerly HSI Canada for those of you who have been around for a while, which together with its affiliates is one of the largest animal protection organizations in the world. Riana works to protect farmed animals by advocating for higher welfare practices, policies and regulations, and also oversees Humane World's Forward Food Program, which we love. Hi, Riana, welcome.
Hi, Kimberly. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation.
I'm so glad to have you all here and your big minds and big hearts. Last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Tayler Zavitz, who is Animal Justice's Advocacy Program Specialist. Tayler brings a powerful combination of scholarly insight and dedicated activism to the animal advocacy movement. She holds a PhD in sociology, specializing in critical animal studies. Tayler, welcome.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here.
So glad to have you. And as you'll find out, Tayler has been very busy on this report that we're going to be sharing today. All right, so folks, we have you all on Spotlight. We're ready to dig in. Let's start off with the baseline. I'm going to throw the first one to you, Alanna. This isn't something most Canadians understand, but we have like somewhere around 1 billion land animals going through farms in Canada every year. And we have like 2.3 million animals being slaughtered every day, which means we have a lot of farmed animals. Yet in Canada, we effectively have no laws protecting them while on those farms. And when I say this, like sometimes even farmers don't understand this, but most people do not get this. So, Alanna, can you please explain this for us?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I think when I talk to even people that care about farm animals and are somewhat knowledgeable about what is happening, they don't realize that we do not have laws that regulate the welfare of farmed animals during their life on farms. We have provisions under the criminal code and provincial animal protection legislation that prohibit certain forms of cruelty, but they don't set proactive standards of care for animals. So they happen only after the fact. And they both fail to protect animals from routine cruelty on farms. So I'm going to put my nerdy lawyerly hat on
Yes,
and dig into
please.
these two things quickly. So we have criminal code cruelty provisions. I think we hear them talked about often in the case of dogs and cats. And these provisions prohibit what is causing unnecessary pain, suffering, or injury to an animal. And the key there is the word unnecessary. And in practice, the way that courts and enforcement agencies interpret this is that pain and suffering associated with routine farming practices is considered necessary for food production, no matter how significant the pain or suffering may be for an animal. So essentially, if something is done, even if it causes significant distress and it is something that is routine in food production, it is considered necessary. And so the main criminal code provision doesn't apply.
So it just
Yeah.
just negates it. So
Yeah.
anything that we actually had in law does not apply to farmed animals for the most part.
Even forms of egregious like torture and cruelty, we have not seen a case where there has been a prosecution under the criminal code in relation to farm animals. Even again, egregious sadistic torture and abuse would be treated under the provincial legislation. But even our provincial laws fail to protect farmed animals from the majority of cruelty. And so we have provincial legislation in every province that prohibit causing distress to animals. The language differs from one province to another. However, every law in every province and territory exempts distress arising from what is called generally accepted practices, reasonable and generally accepted practices. And what this means is that if a practice is widely used by an industry, it's considered generally acceptable and therefore exempt from the law.
No
So
matter how bad it is, no matter how
no
much
matter
it
how
makes
it
an animal
is.
suffer.
Right. So I know Maha and some of my other colleagues are going to be talking about some of the horrible things that are happening. But if we talk about a method that's often used to kill piglets on farms called thumping via blunt force trauma, you can think about if you were doing that to a dog or a cat, you would undoubtedly be subject to prosecution under the criminal code or provincial animal protection acts. But because this is a routine practice on farms, it's considered generally acceptable and therefore falls within the provincial exemptions.
Hmm. And yet the animals are no different in how they think, feel, suffer. They're just different in the way they're used. So that's the bottom line.
Yeah, and even if you were thinking about a pig that was kept as a companion animal, so people have pot-bellied pigs. If many of the things that we see on pig farms were to be done to a companion animal pig, they would be subject to prosecution under the provincial animal protection legislation and even possibly the criminal code.
Mm. Oh, Alanna, thank you for that. So Taylor, we often hear the animal ag industry refer to codes of practice. Can you explain what these are? And we also hear the word NFAC sometimes. So yeah, give us a little rundown.
Yeah, so when people hear the term codes of practice, it sounds like we're talking about laws, right? Like these sort of rules that farms are legally required to follow to protect the welfare of animals, but that's not actually what these codes are. So in Canada, animal welfare standards on farms are developed through a private industry-dominated organization called the National Farm Animal Care Council, or like you said, NFAC. And over time, the government has essentially allowed NFAC to become the national standard setter for how animals are treated on farms in the country. So NFAC presents itself as this neutral body that brings together farmers and industry representatives, scientists, governments, and animal welfare groups to create these like balanced standards. But in reality, the organization is overwhelmingly dominated by the animal agriculture industry itself. About 87% of its members represent industry-aligned organizations. So that's groups like dairy, pork, chicken, and beef associations, along with processors and retailers. So out of its current 54 members, only 2 members represent animal welfare organizations. So the same industries profiting from animal farming are also largely the ones writing the actual welfare standards. And these standards are what are called these codes of practice. And these codes of practice cover things like housing, confinement, mutilations, and killing practices for animals on farms. But the key thing to note about these codes is that they are not law, they are voluntary guidelines. So NFAC uses language like requirements or standards, which gives the impression that they are legally enforceable, but they're not. So these codes are merely voluntary guidelines. They don't create enforceable legal obligations under Canadian legislation. And on their own, they do not establish any government penalties for noncompliance. So there's no independent enforcement body, there's no routine public inspections tied specifically to these codes. So NFAC has no lawmaking power, no enforcement power, and really no public accountability. And yet, the government increasingly relies on these codes as though they are meaningful regulation. So these codes are often referenced in policies, in inspection guidance, and industry communications, creating the impression that farmed animals are protected by these like legal safeguards, when in reality, the system is voluntary and industry controlled. And this is especially concerning with the lack of meaningful public accountability and transparency. So NFAC is, like I said, a private organization, but it receives millions of dollars in public funding to develop and update these codes. And despite that, it is not subject to the kinds of oversight that we would expect from a public regulator. So it's not governed by things like freedom of information laws. There's very little transparency around how decisions are made, and the public has very limited ability to scrutinize the process. And importantly as well, there's also no system of proactive, independent oversight to ensure that animals are actually being protected on farms. So Canada does not have routine government inspections focused on farmed animal welfare. So enforcement is largely reactive, right? Meaning that authorities often only become involved after a complaint, a whistleblower report, or an undercover investigation surfaces evidence of abuse. So what we end up with is a system where industry largely writes its own standards. Those standards are voluntary, and there's limited independent oversight. And that creates a serious problem because it allows governments and industry to point to the existence of standards and say animal welfare is being addressed while avoiding the creation of strong, enforceable legal protections for animals on farms.
Wow. Yeah, it's really mind-boggling. It's basically it is the fox guarding the literal hen house, right? The people
Yeah.
that are profiting off of animals are in charge of their welfare. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good, you know? So no inspections, no transparency, no laws. Sayara, can you please fill us in on why Sorry, as my face, that was
That
for
was so
dramatic
dramatic.
effect, right?
I
Can
thought you
you?
were going to say something really groundbreaking.
Kimberly, before you hop to the next question, I just
Yeah,
wanted to mention, because when we
yeah,
were going through the
please.
report, this was a how do we explain the laws before we get to the codes? I think one of the things that's important to point out also is that these codes of practice are actually used as a defense. So they're not laws, but in some of these provincial legislation, they can actually be pointed to a defense. So if ever someone were to be charged under provincial legislation for causing distress to an animal, all they have to do is say, well, that distress is covered in the code. Other farmers are doing it and therefore get it a jail free card. So I think that's important to recognize is the codes are actually pointed to in laws, but not as minimally required standards, but actually as a way of a get out of jail free card if distress is caused.
Well, and the other thing I was thinking about is when there's no inspections and the only way that there would be an inspection is if it's reported from someone working there or an undercover investigator and who are what's happening in the country, ag gag laws to be, to be prevent that from happening. So basically there is almost no way that an animal will get investigated. There was no way there will be an inspection unless there is somebody incredibly brave that comes forward as a whistleblower. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, okay, so Sayara, why in the world would the Canadian government hand over control like this?
It's it requires a lot of context to talk about this, so I hope everyone
Please
forgives me
take your
for talking
time.
about bureaucracy, and I'll try to make it sexy, but I don't know if Ryan Gosling is ever going to star in a movie about regulatory capture, but you never
We
know.
can only hope.
We can only hope. But so, industrial farming really started to ramp up after the Second World War, and particularly in the 1960s, it was kind of going very quickly. And in the 1970s, Canada instituted something called supply management, which people may or may not be familiar with. But it's essentially, it exists as a closed market for certain industry sectors. So today we still have supply management for eggs, so laying hens, for chickens, broiler chickens, for meat, and for in the dairy industry. And the fact that this system exists, and it doesn't exist in every sector, but just I think it creates a context for, within kind of agriculture in Canada in general. It gives these industries a huge amount of power because it's a closed market, which means they're not threatened by, by cheap cheese coming in from the US or cheap milk coming in from the US because it regulates the trade of the product they're selling. So if I'm an egg farmer, for example, I don't sell my eggs to Loblaws. I sell my eggs to the provincial marketing board, and they give me a guaranteed price for those eggs because I have quota. I might have 15,000 laying hens worth of quota, which means I never have to worry about selling my product. I just sell them to the marketing board, and the marketing board sells them to Loblaws and Sobeys and Metro and whoever. That system means that also I don't really need to think about, about competition, about innovation, because I know I will always have somewhere to sell my product. And I will always have a guaranteed price for it. And I'm saying all this really just as context. Like supply management is incredibly political and a hot button issue. This is not something that the animal movement plans on targeting in any way because it would be a total non-starter. And we don't have any guarantee that it would be helpful to remove it, but it is a system that's there. And it helped these industries build up an enormous amount of power, and particularly political power. Someone that I know in Ottawa who works on the Hill, on Parliament Hill, told me that these groups, they really understand continuity and relationships. So they'll have someone who is, a government relations person who's been there for 30 years, who will go and almost personally meet every new MP who's elected and be able to, to call the important ones at the drop of a hat when something happens, because they have built those relationships over time. They're good at it, and they've built up that access. If you call the person that you know best in the world, and the conversation would sound, completely nonsensical to anybody else. You call them and you're like, "Hey, did you?" And they're like, "Yeah, yeah, I did the thing." And you're like, "Cool. Can we talk about it? Yeah, we'll talk about it on Wednesday." You don't even have to have a full conversation because you've got such a rapport. And that kind of rapport in politics translates into power and into access. And these groups also have an enormous amount of resources. So they collect money from producers, from their members, from government subsidies, and from the revenue of of the products that they sell. And, if you look at a group like the Dairy Farmers of Canada, for example, I think this is like my back of the napkin math, so don't quote me, but a reasonable estimation of their budget for marketing and lobbying per year is about $50 million, which is just an astronomical amount of money to think about in terms of how often that lets you go to Ottawa to meet with legislators, to meet with regulators, to bring them to your facilities. They meet your family. It creates this environment where you have access and you have power, and you also have access to the public. If you pay attention, like advertising to me now is kind of just a wash. I don't even notice it. But if you look around, you will see just like general ads for the dairy farmers, for the Pork Council. They're not particularly advertising anything except their brand, because they have the resources to do that. And obviously, just kind of saturating marketing has a really compounding and impactful effect over time. So it's a way for them to build that power and to maintain it. And so when we have that kind of power, and also things like supply management, you have very little incentive to change or to listen to the public when there's a huge groundswell for change. So when there were a lot of retailer and restaurant commitments, about 10 years ago, to go to cage-free eggs or crate-free pork. Pork is not supply managed, but eggs are. So a lot of, like egg farmers could basically just say to the big retailers, we're not going to meet your targets because you have nowhere else to go, and I have that leverage. So they've been put in this situation where they can basically just say no to a public demand for innovation in terms of animal welfare. And these industries also understand that change can be made from the inside. We talk a lot amongst ourselves in the movement about, the revolving door between industry and government. And so, they understand how change can be made from the outside, but also the inside. So you'll see people leave an industry association and go and be, an advisor to an influential bureaucrat in Agriculture Canada or Health Canada. It's very common. We see it all the time, federally, provincially, and it gives them again a different type of access and a different type of influence, but one that's just as powerful. And when you have both, it's kind of a secret recipe, and you can see examples of how this plays out, how it really manifests. So if we look recently at the federal transport regulations, which were finally, after decades of attempts by the animal movement to pressure the government into updating transport regulations, they were updated. But you see some of the initial changes that were proposed, so such as only allowing laying hens to be transported for 24 hours. That was the initial proposal from CFIA, and then that was changed to 36 hours, which we know was due to industry influence because of access to information requests. And that's even after the scientific recommendation is 8 hours, because those animals are really compromised at the end of their lives. They have very weak bones, they've lost a lot of calcium, they're very prone to being injured. So you have the scientifically recommended number, which is here, and then the number that the government is willing to go to. And then when industry gets involved, you have the number that we actually end up with. And of course, this has huge impacts on the welfare of millions of animals.
From
Um,
8 to 36. Yeah,
it,
don't even that percentage
yeah,
is incredible.
It's
Yeah.
it's it's wild to think about. And we are very far behind. I'm sure we'll talk about this in many of the questions, but we're very far behind other parts of the world on things like this. With transport times, it's really easy just to compare the numbers, because it's like, 36 hours in Canada, 8 hours in Europe. So these animals are being forced to endure just horrific conditions because of the regulatory situation that's been created by this industry power over time. And then even, when you were talking about NFAC, Tayler, I think we see another example of this, which is even when a code is created. So the most recent pig code put a phase out date of 2024 for ending the permanent use of gestation crates for sows. But then the industry said, you know what, we can't meet that date. We're going to change it to 2029. But the code committee couldn't reach a consensus, so that wasn't actually formalized in a code. But so the industry is just doing it anyway. So even when we have a standard, a lot of the time, industry can just unilaterally decide to change that standard and not face any consequences.
Because nobody knows who NFAC is. So, how are people supposed to come after them when they don't know who they are, where they are,
Yeah,
what they are? Yeah.
yeah,
And Sarah, there's also, in the small ways that government is involved, tell us there is such a huge conflict of interest, not only with those integrated relationships, but the ministries.
Yeah, so we have all of the problems I just laid out, but then also just a really structural inbuilt issue, which is that provincially and federally, animal welfare for farmed animals falls under the Ministry of Agriculture, which kind of sounds intuitive and logical when you first think about it, but then when you look a little bit deeper, it's kind of like having natural resources under the Ministry of the Environment, or probably the other way around. You wouldn't want people who want to start a new, like, an oil field or a mine to be in charge of the environmental protections that affect those areas as well, which is essentially what we have. So the mandate of any agricultural ministry is to promote agricultural products and to support Canadian producers, which makes sense. But when at the same time you're asking them to police those producers and to potentially make them make new investments, hire more staff to make sure that welfare is better respected, you're asking them to wear two hats at the same time. If when you were a kid, you asked your dad if you could go outside and climb on the roof, and he tells you he thinks that's fine, but you should go and ask your mom just to be sure. And then because your mom is responsible and she cares about your health and safety, she tells you absolutely not. The system we have is if you went back to your dad the second time and he was just wearing a wig and he was like, yeah, yeah, sure, it's fine. We have one ministry trying to do two very different things. As you said, it's the fox guarding the hen house. So we have two problems, which is that we have weak or non-existent regulations that are heavily influenced by the industries that profit from them. And then we have a lack of enforcement because, I mean, we also have a capacity issue with enforcement, but also the place that the enforcement is coming from is just has this inbuilt conflict of interest, which is preventing them from truly acting independently to oversee this issue.
Mm. Sarah, thank you. That was a noble, a noble explanation of some really complex issues. So you get a gold star. Um, Maha, what does this all mean? Let's bring it back. So many of us are here for the animals. What does this mean to the hundreds of millions of animals going through this country's animal ag system every year?
Yeah, so, when Canadians think of a farm, they might picture green pastures, animals with the freedom to move, room to forage, to graze. But for most of the millions of the countless animals you are talking about who are kept and killed for food in this country every year, that image is a myth. The current system doesn't just allow for suffering, it codifies it through standard practices that include extreme confinement, routine mutilations, and brutal killing. Let's start with the more than 28 million egg-laying hens kept in Canada. For decades, the egg industry has kept hens in battery cages. These are wire enclosures where 4 to 8 hens are packed so tightly they cannot even spread their wings. Each hen is given floor space that's smaller than a standard sheet of paper. And science shows that birds in confinement suffer immensely. They suffer bone lesions, liver problems, painful sores, and they get bored, among a lot of other issues. And under current NFAC codes, which were revised in 2017, there is a call to phase out conventional cages by 2036. That may sound like progress, but hold on, it's not. First of all, 2036 is 10 years away. And more alarmingly, NFAC codes give farmers the option to transition to enriched cages rather than fully cage-free systems. Sayara was saying marketing is good. Enriched is a marketing term. Enriched cages are basically a repackaged battery cage, just a bit larger, and they give birds minimal enrichments. Each bird is in an enriched cage is given floor space roughly the size of a legal sheet of paper. She is still on wire floors. She still cannot truly forage. She still cannot dust bathe or comfortably spread her wings. And she still endures physical and psychological distress. And while the Canadian public overwhelmingly supports an end to cages, the industry responded with a loophole that basically evades a full cage-free transition. And when we talk about Canada lagging behind global peers at only 20% cage-free, it's because the industry is building new cages instead of removing them. And we see similar suffering and confinement in the pork industry with mother pigs. Most spend their lives in gestation crates. These are metal stalls so narrow, they're the size of the pig, and these mother pigs cannot even turn around. The confinement causes her joint pain, muscle weakness. It prevents her from rooting, from foraging, nesting, socializing. And she can become so stressed that these pigs are often chew on their crate bars to cope with these stressful conditions. And as Sayara mentioned, the industry originally committed to phasing out gestation crates by 2024. They missed that deadline and failed to set, a 2021 deadline as the next one. And even when mother pigs are moved to group housings, the current codes allow them to be kept in those same body-sized crates for up to 5 weeks during their pregnancy. So it's a cycle of confinement that never really ends for these pigs. And confinement isn't even just limited to hens and mother pigs. We've all seen the ads of happy cows and grassy fields, but the reality again for the majority of cows at Canadian dairy farms is that they're kept in tie stall systems. They are literally tethered by the neck in individual stalls, often for their entire lives. So imagine a sentient social animal who's unable to move freely or interact with others. The tethering again leads to muscle disorders, painful lameness for these cows. And really, this practice has been allowed to continue simply because Canada lacks meaningful and enforceable standards. Um, I'm also going to talk about broilers who are chickens raised for meat. Broilers is what the industry calls them. These are the largest group of land animals raised and killed for food in Canada, more than 780 million birds a year. These chickens have been selectively bred to grow at an explosive, unnatural rate. They reach market weight in just a few weeks, so they're basically giant babies in adult bodies when they are killed. Their bodies and skeletal frames really can't keep up with the rapid weight gain, so they live in constant pain. It's common to see birds who are just a few weeks old suffering from heart failure, respiratory distress, they suffer from crippled leg deformities, and they often even collapse under the weight of their own bodies. And the suffering goes even deeper. Standard practices in Canada include animals enduring horrific mutilations, sometimes without any pain relief. We're talking about piglets having their tails sliced off or hens having the tips of their beaks burned away. And then there's the killing of animals who are not deemed viable. One example is the one Alanna gave, which is very brutal, but I'm going to say it again because it really illustrates the point. Weaker piglets are being killed by a method called thumping, which involves slamming their heads against a concrete floor. And these are not accidents. They are NFAC approved methods. Everything I described is the baseline for farmed animals in Canada in 2026. This is the lived reality of hundreds of millions of animals. And whether it's a hen in a cage, a mother pig in a crate, or a chicken who's caged in their own body, the story is the same. The industry is prioritizing profit over the need of sentient, sensitive, and social animals. We cannot rely on voluntary codes set by an industry-dominated framework. We need a national framework that treats animal welfare as a matter of public interest and basic decency.
And I think that's what Canadians, almost every Canadian would expect. Thank you, Maha. I mean, Riana, this sounds like something out of the dark ages. Where does this put Canada in terms of global welfare standards? In this time of we're trying to get all these new trade partners, um, where are we? Where do we sit?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Thank you for the question. It's unfortunate that we find ourselves in this position because I think a lot of Canadians like to think that we are a progressive country and we care about our animals. Everyone on the street, you ask any person, no matter how they choose to live, do you think that an animal should suffer? The answer to that question is always no. But our laws just don't reflect that. So unfortunately, I think most Canadians, as we've kind of alluded to through this conversation already, would be surprised to learn just how much of a laggard Canada actually is when it comes to farmed animal regulations. So our absence of meaningful laws for animals on farms has put us behind countries like the entire European Union, so all of its 27 members, the United Kingdom, Australia, Switzerland, New Zealand, and even several US states that have adopted state level bans on some of the worst practices that animals endure. So across these regions, you'll see statutes or regulations or legislation that establish enforceable minimum standards for either how animals can be cared for or housed or transported or slaughtered. And that's not to say that these laws are perfect. There's certainly room for improvement in these other jurisdictions as well. But these laws are uh, much more science-based than our standards here in Canada, which are quoted to be science informed, meaning that science is supposed to be taken into the process or consideration when developing the standards here, but there's not a requirement that they be rooted in science. And that's why we see economic and other criteria take precedence, as my colleagues have explained. So to give you an example of how this plays out, I know we've already talked about intensive confinement for a bit, and I think we will continue to hear that from us because just because of how much suffering it causes and how how much opposition there is and how much progress there's been around the world away from intensive confinement systems. So when you look at intensive confinement and how Canada stacks up, many other regions have banned these systems because they severely restrict animals' movement and prevent them from engaging in any of their natural behaviors, causing severe pain and injury and distress, as Maha just explained. So you'll see countries like Switzerland and Luxembourg and Bhutan and Austria, Germany, the Czech Republic, Denmark, two regions in Belgium that banned cages decades ago and have not had cages for years. And Canada, as we've heard, is at about 20% cage free. And we've seen incremental gains in that over the last decade. And that's why issues like this are why Canada receives a failing grade or a D grade when it comes to the Global Animal Protection Index. It's a problem that we're failing animals and we're also failing the public whose views are not reflected by the institutions who are supposed to reflect their care and concern for animals and their compassion. And Kimberly, you mentioned trade. So
Yeah.
that's especially important, I think, in this moment we find ourselves in where new trading relationships or renewed trading relationships for Canada are more important than ever. And this poses serious risks to Canada's ability to continue to access international markets. You look at other regions like in the EU where their laws are years ahead of where ours are, and they're actively looking at applying their local animal welfare standards to imported products, meaning that if an imported product doesn't meet their domestic standards, then they are considering not allowing that moving forward. And that's, I think, because there's a recognition that low animal welfare standards in a country like Canada effectively operates as a hidden subsidy by allowing producers to save money, produce animal products more cheaply, and then compete on an international market where other farmers are held to a higher standard of animal care. So I would not be surprised if this becomes a significant issue relating to trade in the coming years.
Thank you, Riana. So thank you for everybody for just bringing us up to speed. That's huge. And Linda in the chat just asked, how do we change it? So this is where you know, why we're here tonight, folks. The current structure of protection for farmed animals is something everyone in farmed animal advocacy has been just agonizing over for years. You know why now. So, Riana, what brought Animal Justice and Humane World for Animals and Mercy for Animals and Montreal SPCA together at this juncture to develop a new national plan for the protection of farmed animals?
Yeah, so we've collaborated on various legal issues, for example, over the years where, I saw a couple people in the chat mention the rise of ag gag laws, agricultural gag laws. That's something that, many of us have fought together, and also supporting laws that are better for animals. So, there's the ongoing issue of live horse exports, but that's something that, many of us have collaborated to support. So we've unified on issues where we think that there needs to be, movement-wide support. And as a movement, we've also been working, as we've mentioned, on intensive confinement for years. And for a while, As I think, Sarah, you alluded to years ago, there were all these commitments and there was optimism about things changing because food companies and then NFAC promised to start to do away with some of these intensive confinement systems. And it looked like we might actually have a hope of eliminating cages and crates from Canadian farms. But in the past few years, what we've seen is a startling lack of progress in this planned transition away from cages. And with NFAC, the National Farm Animal Care Council, even backtracking on its own promise to phase out the continuous use of gestation crates, so those crates for mother sows that Maha was describing, by 2024. Those are still being used, and the current plan is to phase them out now, their continuous use by 2029. We would have liked to see a full ban, and we would have liked it to be implemented already. So that's an example of backtracking just from NFAC. And now what we're seeing is producers who are not switching readily to cage-free housing. They're going to these enriched cages that were mentioned instead. And companies, major food companies with cage-free commitments, are continuing to buy and sell products that come from animals who are kept in these intensive confinement systems. So we talked about how in Canada, only about 1 in 5 hens has actually been freed from a cage over the last several years. And that has been a slow gain, slow progress, because about almost 10 years ago now, 2017, 2018, Canada was around 10 or 11% cage free. So we've only made like single digit progress in the last 9 years or so, about 1% a year on average. If you look at the US, they were in the same place as us. About 2017, 2018, it was 10, slightly higher percent of animals, of hens in the egg industry were not kept in cages. Now they are almost at 50%. They have made almost 40% of an improvement in the huge volume of hens that are kept in these horrific cages, and Canada is just completely trailing behind. So I think that all of us notice that there are these systemic barriers in Canada that just don't exist elsewhere, be it NFAC or supply management, as we heard about, that's really preventing meaningful progress for hundreds of millions of animals that are farmed, who are farmed and killed in this country every single year. So and collectively, we decided, it's time to present a solution. It's time to share a better way forward that would actually bring Canada into the 21st century when it comes to farmed animal welfare and create a system that actually starts to resemble something that aligns with the public's views of what our legal system should look like for animals.
Ba-ba-ba-bum. And there enters our national framework for farmed animal protection. Our Dr. Tayler Zavitz has been heading up this project, and Tayler, it's almost kind of like introducing your baby to the world. Tayler, can you this framework right now in its sort of beginning stages is in a joint report that we've presented and that Tayler has spearheaded. So Tayler, can you give us just a little idea of what that report looks like, and then we'll dig into the details.
Yeah, absolutely. So you should be able to see my screen there. So this is the report titled Towards a National Framework for Farmed Animal Protection. The joint report that we put together, that what it really does is pulls back the curtain on how farmed animal welfare is actually governed in the country. So I'm just going to really sort of briefly run through the report here. And I hope it doesn't give you like whiplash with how quickly I'm going through this. But so the first sort of section, the Canada's farmed animal welfare problem, this first section gives sort of like a general overview of Canada's farmed animal welfare issues, looking at things like the scale of the problem, how many animals are killed each year for food, and how Canada is an international outlier within an animal welfare framework. And then the second section of the report looks at the current legal framework, or really, as we've been talking about, the lack of one within the country. And the report outlines that Canada does not have a comprehensive legal system specifically designed to protect farmed animals. But instead, what we have are protections that are fragmented, that are weak and filled with loopholes, like Alanna was talking about earlier. We've got federal transport and slaughter laws, but they are minimal and often vague. And then we have provincial animal cruelty laws, as Alanna talked about, which usually exempt these generally accepted agricultural practices. So in practice, that means that if a harmful practice is common in the industry, then it's often treated as being legal, right? Even if it causes significant suffering. So then what you get is a system where legality is often shaped by industry norms rather than independent welfare standards. And then the report looks at enforcement, and this is where the gap becomes even clearer. So there's very limited proactive oversight. As I said previously, farms are generally not inspected on a routine basis for animal welfare. Instead, enforcement is reactive. So because farms are private, closed environments, and because there's very little independent access, the system relies heavily on internal reporting. And that means that harm is often addressed only after it has already occurred. And, you
So
know,
basically, this part, Taylor, is everything that we just spoke about,
yeah.
and so you lay that out really in much more detail than we've even gone into tonight. So, and then there's a second part, right?
Yep, so we get into from there, this starts to look at how standards are actually set in practice. So this is where the conversation around NFAC comes in, right? Which I discussed earlier. And so I'm not going to go into much detail here because we already talked about it, but just to sort of situate it in the bigger picture, it's looking at how, the important takeaway from the section is that these codes sit in a kind of middle space where they are heavily relied upon by the industry, but they're not legally binding, and they are backed by inconsistent enforcement or inspection infrastructure. So the report examines who controls NFAC, how the codes are developed, why the process is structurally tilted toward industry interests. We look at the lack of transparency and accountability within NFAC's system. And then the report moves into what those codes actually allow in practice, right? Many of the things that Maha already talked about earlier. So again, looking at things like intensive confinement systems, mutilations without pain relief, on-farm killing practices. And then again, we're looking at how Canada is not following international standards. So it shows how these practices are increasingly being phased out, restricted, outright banned in other places around the world, and Canada is falling behind. And so then the last part, and maybe the most important part of the report is looking at solutions, right? So we outline recommendations for what a meaningful national farmed animal protection framework could actually look like. So at a very high level, that's moving away from this fragmented voluntary guidance that we currently have and instead toward enforceable legal standards, things like independent inspections and oversight, things like greater transparency, stronger public accountability, and laws that actually reflect modern scientific understandings of animal sentience and welfare. So overall, the report really highlights this clear gap between how farmed animal protection is commonly understood by the public and how it's presented by the industry, and how it actually operates in practice through law enforcement and these industry-led standards.
Excellent, Taylor. And for those of you that are wanting to help move this plan that we're about to deep dive into forward, this here that Taylor is showing you is a really important tool, and we're going to actually put that to use tonight. More on that in a few minutes. But Alanna, let's have you start with the details. This all starts with a Federal Animal Welfare Act. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's interesting you say it, and it sounds so monumental for us in Canada, but so many of our peer countries have that. The UK, all of the countries in the EU, Switzerland, New Zealand. We need comprehensive federal legislation that establish enforceable standards of care for animals raised or killed for food, in line with international best practices and national legislation that exists in peer countries. Bottom line, that is the number one priority. We have outlined, looking at what exists in other countries, what we think this legislation needs to entail. And the first thing, which may seem symbolic, is recognizing animals as sentient beings. We see it, even the province of Quebec has it in their provincial legislation, but many of these other countries have that. And it's important because it recognizes that the welfare of these animals is a matter of national public interest, and affirms that animals, even those used in agriculture, have to be treated in ways that minimize pain, suffering, fear, and distress. So having that as part of the law is something that we do feel is critical. We also want to see interpretive principles that ensure that decisions made under the Act are guided by the best available science, veterinary evidence, and along with evolving societal expectations. As we've talked about, Canadians expect us to be protecting animals, and those societal expectations change, and we're very much behind what Canadians expect us to be able to do. And we also want to ensure that the interpretive principles clearly state that welfare interests of animals should not be subordinate to economic or production considerations, which is what we see in the current system now. So those are sort of two baselines that we want to see for the legislation. Along with that, the legislation should establish general positive duties of care applicable to animals raised or killed for food. So what owners or keepers, those looking after animals, need to do. Example, the UK has a really good, clear piece of legislation that recognizes animals as sentient, imposes a duty on owners or keepers to ensure for animals' general needs, including having a suitable environment, food, water, shelter, opportunities for behavior, and protection from injury, pain, suffering, and disease. So that's a general framework that we want to see. And along with that, and that would be for all animals, would be regulations that would be species specific. So if we look to other pieces of legislation, if you look at, for example, the provinces, some provinces have, what we talked about, animal protection legislation, they all do, but some provinces have specific regulations dealing with, unfortunately, only companion animals. So regulations with detailed standards of care for dogs or for cats based on the specific needs of those species. So we would want to see regulations with specific species standards of care related to, handling, husbandry practices, and other practices that would impact the welfare of that specific species of animals. Additionally, on top of general duties of care and regulations that are species specific, we want to see obviously clear prohibitions on practices that are widely recognized as incompatible with modern animal welfare principles. So many of the things that we've been talking about that Maha described in detail that are currently permitted because industry is allowed to make up its own rules: extreme confinement systems, routine painful mutilations, inhumane killing methods, things that are already prohibited in many, many other countries, we would want to see outlined here as prohibited under our federal legislation. And I think finally, laws are only as good as enforcement and penalties. And right now, even under the existing legislation that we have for transportation and slaughter that we haven't really gotten into, it's not applicable to animals on farm. What we see, and part of the problems, is that the method of penalties, even if there is a violation, is something that essentially is akin to a parking ticket. They're called AMPs. And what this means is that it is paying a fine, there's no prosecution, and for many producers or large companies, it's just the cost of doing business. And so what we want to ensure here is that with a Federal Animal Welfare Act, that violations are meaningfully punished. And that means high fines, that means higher fines for repeat offenders, abilities to seize animals, really do things to ensure that there are deterrent effects for having violations of the regulations or legislation. And that is not something that we're seeing right now with the current transport and slaughter legislation and regulations. So that's sort of an outline of what we want to see in a Federal Animal Welfare Act. And again, it sounds really bold and broad because we don't talk about it here, but this is legislation that exists in many other peer countries. And so it is not far-fetched to think that we need to see that here in Canada.
Thank you, Alanna. Riana, in this vision, in this framework, what do we do with NFAC?
Well, the positive news perhaps is that there's a way to reform the current system so that it still can function with a codes process, but that it's actually working better for animals and again for the people who depend on this system to reflect their values. So I'll talk about that in a second. Just to recap, what are the issues with the NFAC process and the codes that we want to change? There's the lack of independence we talked about. So who is actually writing the codes is generally the industry that they pertain to. They're not transparent, so we don't know how they're developed or what input is really taken when developing them. So, the public is invited to participate in that process, but what happens to public comments, we don't actually know whether they're adhered to or how many people said what or what the end result would be if that was taken into account. There's no accountability baked into the process, so we don't know what compliance rates are, how many producers are following the codes, what happens if there's non-compliance, is there a penalty? None of that is published or shared the way that you would expect it to be. And then because the codes are voluntary and developed through an industry-led process, any reforms that are proposed or discussed can be weakened over time. They can be postponed, as we've seen with delays to planned welfare improvements, or they can just be completely disregarded if it becomes the case that they don't comply with commercial interests anymore. So we need codes that reflect contemporary science and knowledge and public expectations and that actually have transparency and accountability and enforcement baked into the process. So what we would want to see is for NFAC to become, for example, a body that is overseen by the federal government. So there's actual federal legislative oversight within the Animal Welfare Act that Alanna just mentioned. And what that could look like is we could still have codes and code committees, but those code committees would be required to have more balanced representation. So instead of being almost entirely industry or people with ties to industry, it would be a balanced committee composition, including more animal welfare scientists, animal welfare advocates, and that kind of thing, with that committee composition actually defined and enshrined in law so that it can't, change in time over time. It has to be adhered to. You'd want to have a requirement that the codes be science-based, not just science-informed, as I said earlier, and they have to reflect the latest science as well as the available technology that exists, as well as those evolving public expectations that Alanna mentioned regarding animal welfare. We'd want the actual development of the codes process, so the entire development period, to be more transparent. So if you think about if any of you have ever participated in a government consultation, they take a long time, but there's a lot of transparency in terms of the government will publish its intention to do something. It will publish what it's thinking of doing. It will invite public comment, sometimes at multiple periods throughout this process. It will publish a what we heard report, so you can actually see who submitted what, who participated in the process, what their concerns were, and then you'll see the final result. And that is a much more transparent way of developing industry codes or rules. And that would be a much better way to approach these codes. And then finally, you'd want to also have, in addition to those meaningful public participation opportunities that I mentioned, you'd want to have a requirement that the codes be reviewed every so often. So currently they're supposed to be reviewed every 5 years, but that's not mandated. It doesn't often happen, or it doesn't always happen. And it's, again, led by the industries that the codes pertain to. So they essentially decide when to do those reviews. So you'd want to have mandatory review cycles. And then you'd end up with these codes that ideally would be signed off by the minister in charge of the Animal Welfare Act to make sure that they actually comply with or in line with the Animal Welfare Act. And so what you would have essentially is you'd have laws that outline all those required standards of care and prevention of harms, as Alanna mentioned. And then the codes could kind of be like technical guidance for producers. So they would interpret the laws and explain, what that looks like in practice, helping both producers to comply with what the law says, and also helping inspectors and enforcement to make sure that compliance is actually happening. And there is a precedent for this. So in the report, we give the example of New Zealand. They have an animal welfare advisory committee that was established under a similar Animal Welfare Act many years ago. And the whole point of that advisory committee is to create codes that kind of help to operationalize the law. So that would be a way that we could see the codes model continuing to function, but with significant changes and structural reforms that allow it to actually work better for for everyone involved, especially the animals.
Rihanna, that just sounds way too sane. Yeah, like wow, that is the way it should be done. That's the way it is done in other parts of the world. And it feels so far from where we are right now. This is the part of the framework that I'm especially excited about. I mean, I'm excited about all of it, but never mind conflict of interest for government ministers. We're looking at someone representing just the interests of animals. Sayara, tell us about this part of it.
Yeah, so the kind of the inverse to what I talked about before and kind of the natural extension of what Rihanna was just talking about is to have someone independent overseeing an eventual Animal Welfare Act or, new regulations that are, not written by industry itself. And that could look like a few different things. We could have a minister of animal welfare, which kind of sounds like wish casting, like what, a minister of animal welfare? You guys are just making things up now. But we have new ministers all the time. We have a minister of AI now. The
Yeah.
ministerial portfolios evolve as society identifies new priorities. So this isn't something that is as crazy as it kind of sounds based on where we are. And it's something that we've already seen in other countries. So other countries, particularly in Europe, you see some instances of countries having a minister of animal welfare, or in the EU itself, you have a commissioner for animal health and welfare. In Australia, you have an inspector general for animal welfare. And what that means is you have someone who doesn't have any responsibility to report to the industry. So I've seen some questions as well in the comments about veterinarians, and that's a big issue as well, which is like veterinarians obviously go into this industry because they care about animals and they want to help animals. But then at the end of the day, if you get a job working for an industry, that's the person who's signing your paycheck. So you have a huge disincentive to tell them they're doing something wrong, to be a whistleblower, to suggest that they make big changes that will cost them money and time. And this is kind of like the broader example of what that would look like. You have someone that's independently creating and enforcing animal welfare laws and regulations, instead of someone who's trying to police and promote at the same time. And what that results in, because the places that we do see these positions in place, is you also see stronger animal protections in place. So we know that it's something that is effective, and it's a system that exists already. We have a commissioner for the environment in Canada, a commissioner for privacy, and it's having an independent position that is still a part of the government, but that doesn't report to the ministry that is trying to make a profit off something, which gives you a lot more scope to look at things with a critical eye, to conduct inspections, to not want to please your buddies or whatever, because you don't have to maintain a cordial relationship with them because you're not beholden to them in any way. And so it's just the kind of the most logical way to enforce a law is to have someone who doesn't have a vested interest in the status quo.
Mhm.
And when you look at something like inspections, it's the situation we have right now is kind of as if, you go to a restaurant and they have the sign in the window that says, we got 5 stars for food safety. But the people who are in the restaurant are the one that did the inspection. What we want to have and what we do have is a society where it's actually someone independent coming in to do the food safety inspection in the restaurant. And so it would be the equivalent of that for animal welfare on farms, and for the person that those people are reporting up to is independently empowered to create these laws and to enforce them.
Mm. I love the sound of the Minister of Animal Welfare.
Maybe
Um,
maybe someone watching tonight will be our first minister of animal welfare.
yeah, I love it. Sayara, I vote for Sayara.
Oh gosh. You
No.
know what? Sure.
Yeah, yeah, go for it. Okay, so the organizations behind this joint report and many of the folks that are joining us here tonight, they work on making things better for farmed animals through targeting the corporate sector often. So, Maha, where does this work fit into all of this and this new plan?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the reason most, if not all, of the organizations that are here tonight focus so heavily on the corporate sector is these companies can realistically take steps to begin reducing suffering for millions of animals in their operations every year through their sourcing decisions and their buying power. And I'm going to take you on a little bit of a history lesson again. I'm sorry, but just to give you the full context. In the mid 2010s, we all saw a wave of hope. Retailers and restaurants across Canada promised to end the worst forms of confinement. But today, many of those same companies are backtracking on those promises and they are using NFAC as their shield. And to understand how we got here, in 2016, we saw a massive turning point when the Retail Council of Canada, which represents the country's largest grocers, committed to going 100% cage-free by 2025. This could have been a historic win for animals. We know how it goes. In 2021, the RCC retracted that commitment and said they would instead defer entirely to NFAC standards. So this gave individual companies, including massive retailers like Sobeys, the cover they needed to walk away from their own word. Instead of fulfilling their cage-free goals, Sobeys and other food companies are now incorporating a transition toward enriched cages, for example, in their goals. And this is exactly where our corporate accountability work fits in. For example, Mercy for Animals and Animal Justice have been running separate pressure campaigns calling on Sobeys to fulfill their cage-free promise, to make more progress, to tell us what their plans are to accelerate their cage-free progress. Customers deserve to know when companies walk back their goals, and companies should be held accountable for the commitments they made and likely profited from the good faith they got from those commitments for years. One other example is at the end of June, Mercy for Animals is launching our fifth edition of the Canada Animal Welfare Scorecard, where we rank companies on their animal welfare performance. And this type of benchmarking and the public campaigns we run provide accountability in an environment where some companies and industries, as we've heard today, refuse to lead with transparency. So essentially, corporate work allows us to stop companies from being able to humane wash their records, so to speak, by showing exactly those that are keeping their word and those that are failing animals and their customers. And basically, through this work, we're holding a mirror up to the brands to show that while they might aim to meet the bare minimum standards of these weak codes, they're failing to meet the expectations of the majority of Canadians who want to see animals' basic needs met. Ultimately, corporations don't need to wait for a law to do the right thing. They can start to initiate changes in their supply chains today and take steps to increase their sourcing of higher welfare products. And our corporate work actually proves that a more compassionate system is already feasible. We see it with leaders that we've ranked in our scorecard who are keeping their words and have fulfilled 100% cage-free commitments, for example. But when we hold these companies accountable, we're basically laying the groundwork for this national framework. We're proving that if the industry refuses to lead voluntarily, we need a legislative floor to ensure that no animal is left to suffer in a cage or a crate just because a company decided to walk back on their word.
Thank you, Maha. So there is a lot of excitement in the chat about all of this. And there's also some skepticism like, how's this ever going to happen? And I think we have to be pretty clear, Taylor, right, that we're not talking about an overnight thing. This is a big, big vision, ambitious plan. So how do we actually bring it into being?
Yeah. So this report is really just the foundation of a much longer term plan. And it's, important to be honest, like you said, that meaningful change in this space is not going to happen overnight or through a single policy moment, unfortunately, right? As much as we may want it to. So this is something that's going to be built over time and in stages. Um, what we're talking about really, is sort of like a 10-year plan, 10-year roadmap to shift both public understanding as well as public policy. So, the first stage of that plan starts with awareness. So right now there's a significant gap between what most Canadians believe about farmed animal protection and what actually exists in practice. So the first step then needs to be public education and awareness building. That means sharing this report widely, helping the public learn what is actually happening within modern animal agricultural systems within Canada. And it also means helping people better understand Canada's position internationally, where, like I said, Canada is increasingly an outlier on key welfare issues. And then the second phase is going to be turning that awareness into sustained policy engagement. So again, that doesn't mean, expecting immediate legislative overhaul. Rather, it means consistent incremental change. So work including building relationships with policymakers and their staff, preparing briefing materials and having meetings with them, making sure that farmed animal protection is actually present in policy discussions where currently it's generally absent or treated as a secondary issue. And another key part of that is bringing this work directly into academic and legal spaces.
Mhm.
So that includes things like presenting this work at law faculties, engaging with students and researchers and legal scholars, contributing to the legal scholarship around animal law in Canada. And it also includes opportunities like presenting to the Animal Welfare Caucus, where there's, a real potential to introduce these issues into more formal policy conversations, building, political understanding and momentum. And then alongside that, there's an important role for collaboration. And that's not just within Canada, like we're seeing here with organizations working together, but internationally, right? So this work is strengthened by learning from and working with international partners and coalitions that have already begun to shift the policy landscape in their own countries. So we can learn a lot from other jurisdictions that have built coordinated coalitions between animal advocates, lawyers, veterinarians, and policy experts. So, one example is groups like the Australian Animal Alliance, who have shown how this sustained, structured collaboration can gradually move animal welfare issues from the margins and into mainstream policy discussions. So, the core idea is that change is cumulative. So, again, this is not one single reform or one specific moment of change, but it's about building a sustained sort of ecosystem of knowledge and advocacy and policy engagement over time. And ultimately, that goal will be to move toward a system where farmed animal welfare is no longer governed primarily through these voluntary standards, but through, clear enforceable legal protections. So, in short, it's a long game, right? But
Absolutely.
yeah, it's one that starts with, making the issue visible, making it understandable, and making it impossible to ignore in ongoing public and policy discussions.
Hmm. Thank you so much, Taylor. That's we've got our work cut out for us, and folks. So this is where you come in. This is the starting. Like I really like I would like for us in 10 years to be able to look back and go, the moment this started was May 14th, 2026 at this panel. That's my big dream right now. So we have about 175 people here live, and I really want to be able to put this kind of community into action. So what I'm going to propose is, in order to build the political will that Taylor is talking about, we need to build public will. And as Taylor said, that starts with informing as many people as possible. So what I'm going to ask you to do tonight is to help us get this joint report in front of as many eyes as possible. So there's a couple of choices here. Many of you have social media accounts. And we have a very simple graphic and a caption or a choice of a couple of captions that you can work with and post right now. And I tell you, if 175 of us post about this right now, it is going to have an effect, okay? It's going to create some ripples. Even though it's, 20 after 8, that's okay. Thursday nights, busy on social media. So I know you'll say, "Oh, well, I'll do it later." But if we all do it now together, it gets done, okay? Better done than perfect. So I'm going to show you right now, and actually, Rachel, you can drop the action item into the chat. And as soon as we're done this, we're going to take a couple of questions. So let me see here. I'm going to just share my screen. And here we go. Okay, so folks, this is what we're going to be doing here. Oops, that's not what I want to share. Okay, so this is the graphic in the folder that we are dropping into the chat. There is this graphic. Did you know that there are effectively no laws protecting the billion animals on Canadian farms each year, and we have a plan to change that? So just a captivating kind of graphic that you would upload as your graphic on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, whatever you want to use. And then we have also in this folder just some options for captions. Okay, so we have here a longer social media post. You can copy and paste this. We're happy to have you copy and paste this. We're just going to change this. I'm just changing this right now. Okay, whoops, sorry. I don't know why that just went there. Okay. So we are just changing that right now because we had a link that isn't working properly. And so you can just copy and paste this and then put that as the caption for your thing. Here's a shorter social media caption if you want to do something shorter. And again, Nevis is just going to change the URL in that. Or if you're not a social media person, who loves animals in your life? Send them an email right now. Here, we've got an email already made up for you, and this is, you can just copy and paste that. So what we're going to do is we're just going to give you about three minutes. We're going to put some music on, and folks, just go open your social media accounts, download that graphic, upload it to your social media accounts, copy and paste one of the social media posts, and let's get at it. We're going to put on some music while you do that. You've got 3 minutes to do this, folks, and then we come back and we're going to answer a couple of questions. So 3 minutes, and I'm going to stop sharing so that we can put some music on. Okay. And again, the folder that all of this is in the chat. It's right now the most current comment. I don't hear any music, Kirsten, just so there we go. Thank you. I'm trying to find the link to report. Can someone post that again? So right now, the sharing of this is probably going to be the most effective. We will have more actions as we go around political actions we can take. But for now, this is the one to be able to get this report, to get Taylor's baby out into the world further than just this panel. Okay, done. Cue up the punk rock, Debbie says. Excellent. When you've done this, please just let us know in the comments that you have taken action. Yes, thank you so much for putting that URL. Okay. And if you're doing an email, we'd love to hear it. Who are you sending an email to? Again, even if you can't get that done in the next 3 minutes, get it set up so it is ready. There is nothing like taking action in this moment, folks. I'm going through and I'm looking at the gallery and I'm seeing people getting busy and I love it. Oh, everybody's got their serious face on. Everybody's concentrating very hard. Excellent. Okay, Elle says done. Julie says done. Mary says done. iPhone says done. Jenny says any hashtags. We don't have a hashtag for this yet. That should have been our social media game here. What's going to be our hashtag for this, folks? I think one hashtag that could be very helpful is CDN Poly, just to get this seen by federal politicians. So hashtag CDN Poly. The what? Yeah, CDN Poly. I've got a peanut gallery here. Thank you, Kirsten, for putting that in. Love it. Leslie, post it on Facebook. We'll also send it to family and friends. Thank you so much. We are saying, Gasson is saying done. Dora's saying done. Anne Marie, done. Tanya, done. On Insta and Facebook. Oh, excellent. Leslie, yes. Canadian Values is also a good hashtag. Linda said done to my local, provincial, and federal representative. She's getting a jump on it. Catherine Baker said, sorry, can't do it under pressure, screwed up. That's all right, Catherine. Just delete and try it again. Excellent. Jenny tweeted, okay, we've got you going. Keep going, folks. Or, just once we're done, get on it. Tweeted, Jenny said. Peter says done. Ms. Samuel said done to my friend. Jessica, done. I love it, folks. Thank you. All right, let's come back. Let's come back to our panelists here. Thank you so much, Kirsten. All right, so gang, I think, if our panelists are just willing to give us a few extra minutes, I wouldn't mind just being able to take some questions. Is that okay for everybody? Okay, if you have to jump off, you just let us know. Because there's some really great questions here. John is asking, what countries have the best practice in ag laws and regulation? And I'm not sure who wants to handle that, but what are the ones that we really want to emulate here?
I can jump in. I think, the EU is definitely way ahead. But I think actually some of the Scandinavian countries, we haven't talked really specifically, but Scandinavian countries really have legislation that prohibits a lot of the practices that we're talking about, including, we didn't really talk that much about NFAC and tie stalls, but including, requirements that dairy cattle have to be permitted outside, can't be permanently tethered. So if we look at Norway and Sweden, Switzerland as well, these are really some of the countries that are sort of the top tier. But even if we're looking at the EU, and I think even maybe Maha or Riana mentioned, there are US states that have legislation that surpasses what we're doing in Canada. So we don't have to look far. But I'd say if we're looking at sort of the top tier of really ensuring for not just the physical well-being of farm animals, but ensuring some minimal standards in terms of psychological well-being, it would really be the Scandinavian countries.
Yeah, they rock. They know how to take care of both their people and animals. It makes sense. Thank you, Alanna. Robin is asking, does the federal government have jurisdiction to pass such legislation? So that's a big question. We've got a country that, has some huge divides between federal and provincial legislation. Anybody want to address that? I'm thinking probably Alanna, because you are the the legal expert here.
Yeah, I don't mind jumping in. So the federal government does have constitutional authority to regulate the welfare of animals on farms. We have probably about 2 or 3 pages in the report that deeper dives into it. But just the short of it is the federal government already regulates transport and slaughter of farmed animals all over Canada. And so that in and of itself shows that the federal government has the ability to regulate this issue. It is something that is joint between the provinces and the federal government. So in theory, if we move forward with the Federal Animal Welfare Act, there isn't anything to say that a province couldn't have even stricter legislation, but this would ensure that all provinces have a minimal baseline in terms of requiring standards of care, species-specific care, and regulations. So it's definitely is there. We just have to move forward with that authority and get a law passed in between now and the next 10 years from now.
Yeah. Okay. Vicento is asking, and not to put you on the spot, but I don't think we have a lot addressing this, but just so we can answer her question, how can we get the government to stop subsidizing dairy or lessen it? And so I guess just in terms of what we're talking about, do we address the subsidies at all in this equation? Anybody want to field that?
I could speak to it a little bit if,
Yeah, please.
and maybe Taylor, there's more detail in the report that you can point to as well. But I think it's kind of important to look at it from a perspective of, rather than just kind of like us versus them, but like a system change that will benefit everybody, will benefit society and animals and even producers, because it's very difficult to force people to do something or to impose things on people and not have a backlash. So if we look at some examples of some other countries, some of those Scandinavian countries that Alanna was mentioning, we've seen programs that will help producers, for example, like transition from right now I have a dairy farm, but I want to get out of this business. And so I'll receive some transition funding. And now I'm farming blueberries, which creates just kind of a win-win for everybody. And looking at that from a different way as well, there's countries that have done things like just increasing funding for other sectors. So increasing funding for plant-based farming, which provides an incentive for people to enter those industries. And so, obviously subsidies can be taken away, can be reduced over time, can be made conditional upon certain things. But creating those models that offer alternatives and that provide incentives as well, I think is an important way to look at it.
Thank you, Sarah. So Connie, who has been just a hero, going up with the pause in Ontario, trying to report farmed animal regulations that are being completely disregarded, and is having a hell of a time in reporting. And so her question is, what is the plan for detection and enforcement with the new framework? Unscheduled audits by an independent group? Who wants to address that? Alanna?
Sure, I can jump in. So we also looked at, brainstorming what are the various options. Right now, we have the Canadian Food Inspection Agency that enforces the federal slaughter and transport laws and regulations. They currently report to the Ministry of Agriculture. So we have that conflict of interest element coming up. And so the ideal system would be a new enforcement body that would enforce the federal animal protection law that we are proposing, as well as existing slaughter and transport regulations that would be very much updated. A second option would be a specific enforcement body within the CFIA. But I think what you're speaking to is not just who is that body, but how do you ensure for appropriate enforcement. And I think the idea there is to build into the legislation that the legislation is not just reactive. In other words, it's not just complaint based. There are proactive required inspections on a regular basis. What that timeline would look like and how that would be written into the legislation is to be determined. But the idea is that it not just be reactive. And I think even with pause, not to delve into right now the situation with puppy mills and dogs in Ontario or other provinces, but a big part of the problems is that these pieces of legislation are reactive in nature. And so there has to be a complaint in the first place. And what we want to see here is proactive legislation with minimal standards of care that are being enforced with inspections that are happening at préalable. So like happening before a complaint is lodged to ensure that those standards are being adhered to.
Excellent. Okay. I know you've been very generous, our panelists and also the rest of our community staying a little bit later. So I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I do just want to sort of hit home. If you didn't have a chance to do the action right now, please, do it first thing tomorrow morning or after we're done, and focus. This is the beginning. We are going to be rolling out all sorts of stages to this and all sorts of ways that you're going to be able to take action on this. This is a huge mountain for us to climb, but just seeing and feeling the passion here and the intelligence, and we have a plan. We have a damn fine plan here. Very well thought out, just really sort of expert framing of everything. And so we've got it. We need to put it out there and we need to go hard on this. So we're going to be rolling out an exciting initiative already next week around this. I can't share the details with you, but in your replay email, when we send out the replay for this event, we're going to share that with you early next week. So folks, just keep your ears open. Please share this. Please share the report. Please share this idea. Please share the excitement about a new way of being for these hundreds of millions of animals that suffer every day across our country behind the closed doors of the animal ag system. Okay, so we can take folks off of speaker spotlight view while we get ready to say goodbye. I just want to mention, if you want more ways to get involved with animal justice, please subscribe to our animal justice email list, join the Animal Justice Action Team, and you can enroll in AJA, and Rachel just dropped all of those links in there. Our next panel, folks, will be June the 10th, and it will be a sister panel to this one. It's all about the insidious and increasingly sophisticated tactics that the animal ag industry is using against the animal protection movement, including front groups, misinformation, activist surveillance, activist criminalization. It's fascinating stuff, and we're going to actually have Tayler back for that one as well, and then some other amazing panelists. Watch for us to send you that registration page within the next couple of weeks. And then July's panel will be Influencing for Animals, featuring 5 influencers in the animal advocacy vegan space, talking about how you can become more influential in your own animal advocacy. All right, if you aren't already on gallery view, make sure you're on gallery view so that you can see everybody. And let's get cameras on, folks, because I want to actually unmute all of you so that you can say your direct thanks to our panelists tonight, who have also been some of the driving forces behind this joint report and this new framework. A big thank you to Tayler, Maha, Riana, Sayara, and Alanna.
Thank you.
Organizations. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
All right, folks, go out there and be brave, be smart, and be compassionate. We will see you next month.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Everyone.